Hello and welcome to our webinar, The Eastbound Iran with a question mark. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi, Director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and the Persian Gulf Studies. Before I start, some comments about the logistics. Each speaker would offer an opening remark of 10 to 15 minutes. After the opening remarks, we'll have a short conversation. After the conversation of 10 minutes or so, I would pose the audience questions to our panelists. The microphones will remain on mute during the webinar, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Ask hard questions, offer critical comments, but please remain respectful and courteous. The anniversary of the Iranian Revolution was just past week. 42 years ago, the Islamic Republic was established. One of the central slogans of the revolutionary movement in Iran was neither Western nor Eastern, only Islamic Republic. This slogan created a conundrum for the Islamic Republic on trying to navigate the country's sovereignty and independence from the influence of the world superpowers. The incessant American and European political and economic pressures and sanctions on Iran has forced the Islamic Republic to look eastward to forge political alliances and trade relations. Can Iran rely on Russia, China, and India to fulfill its strategic, regional, and international interests and overcome its crisis-ridden domestic affairs? We have put together today's panel with these questions in mind. To address these questions, we have invited three leading scholars and commentators on Iran's relation with its Eastern partners. Fatemeh Aman, who just moved from the Atlantic Council to the Middle East Institute as a non-resident senior fellow. Congratulations on that. To Middle East Institute, of course. She has written on Iran, Afghanistan, and broader Middle East and South Asian affairs for more than 20 years. Her writings have appeared in numerous publications of the Atlantic Council and Middle East Institute. Ms. Aman has advised the US government and non-governmental organizations on Iran and its regional policies, and has been a frequent commentator in various media outlets, including BBC, Voice of America, Al Jazeera, and many others. She is the author of the Atlantic Council's Water Dispute Escalating Between Iran and Afghanistan and Resolving Regional Sources of Instability. Dr. Ghoncheh Tazmini is a visiting fellow at the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics. She was an associate member at the Center for Iranian Studies at SOAS in London, where she was also the Iran Heritage Foundation Fellow. Dr. Tazmini has done extensive research on the Iranian Revolution and the processes of reform and in insightful comparative relations to the Russian Revolution. She is the author of Khatami's Iran, the Islamic Republic and the Turbulent Path of Reform, and Revolution and Reform in Russia and Iran, Modernization and Politics in Revolutionary States. She is currently studying Iranian-Russian alignment in the Middle East. Our last panelist is Dr. Zakiyeh Yazdanshenas. She holds a PhD from Tehran University's prestigious Regional Studies program in the Faculty of Law and Political Science. She is currently a research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies in Tehran. She has published widely on Iran's international relations and foreign policy for scholarly journals, as well as different Iranian and international news outlets, including Al Monitor and Foreign Policy. Her forthcoming co-authored book from Tehran University Press is titled China's Rise and Changes in the U.S. Strategy. Hopefully we have a chance to read the book very soon. So on that note, I stop here and ask my colleague Fatemeh Aman to start talking about Iran and its immediate eastern neighbors and India in South Asia. And because I think this is one of those less talked about topics when we are thinking about Iran's strategic, regional, and international policies. And particularly, I think at the end, we are going to have this conversation about the sort of expanding influence of China and how that would affect Iran's relation with India. So why don't we start with that? And again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to all three of you. And please go ahead, Fatemeh Aman. You are on mute, I think.
Okay, I think
yes,
we can hear.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this great event and with such a timely topics and distinguished guests. I will briefly talk about Iran's role in South Asia region and how international and US sanctions have pushed Iran more and more toward that region, and how US-Iran dispute harmed the interests of the entire South Asia region. In the past decade, driven by sanctions over its nuclear program, Iran has developed closer relationship with partners in Asia. Pressure from the West and especially the United States left Iran with little choice but to intensify trade with Asian powers such as India. While South Asian partners have provided Iran with a refuge, actually, in the face of international sanctions, they haven't done so out of sense of altruism. South Asian countries, especially India and Pakistan, have tried to take advantage of Iran's lack of options to dictate favorable terms in economic agreements. India, one of Iran's largest economic partners, took advantage of the fact that it was for some time partly exempt from US sanctions against Iran. But these countries eventually also had to pay a price for their cooperations. Let me start with Iran and India. Iran's geographic position gives it unique strategic and economic significance. Iran is a bridge that connects South and Central Asia with the Persian Gulf. Thanks in part to Bush and Obama era sanctions over its nuclear program, Iran gravitated toward India and China, as we will hear from our other friends. India became Iran's second largest trading partner after China. In particular, the India-Iran bound grew because India is a major oil importer, and Iran is one of the largest oil exporter. But trade with India and China under sanctions came at a cost to Iran's economy. So restrictions on Iranian access to the international banking system put Iran in a weak negotiating position and played to its economic partners' advantage. The after economic sanctions on Iran were lifted due to 2015 nuclear agreement, JCPOA, in May 2016, Iran, India, and Afghanistan signed a trilateral agreement to develop Iran's port of Chabahar. The goal was to make it part of a corridor connecting India and Central Asia through Iran. Chabahar could end or at least significantly reduce the dependency of landlocked Afghanistan on Pakistan. Right now, it's mostly dependent on the Karachi port in Pakistan. Then came the U.S. maximum pressure campaign. These plans with, among the three countries that I mentioned, were interrupted by the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy aimed at crushing Iran's economy. India's government tried to bargain in the beginning, tried even to resist, but eventually the nationalist government of Prime Minister Modi was not terribly concerned about saving India-Iran ties. So joint projects, including Chabahar, either slowed down or halted completely, and Iran began signaling its openness to other Asian partners, such as China, as maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. There is something that I really believe it's important to mention, the peace pipeline, which is a lost opportunity for South Asia. The peace pipeline, the project was originally proposed as a means to connect rivals in South Asia, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The Iranian section starts at the South Pars gas field in Asaluye and would go through Sistan Balochistan of Iran, and then enters Pakistan, passes through some cities, reach in Afghanistan and even India later. Pakistan joined the project in 1995. Both countries signed a preliminary agreement. 4 years later, in 1999, India also joined this promising project, but it eventually had to withdraw some years later, almost a decade later, under enormous US pressure. So India was threatened by Condoleezza Rice in one of her trips to India, mentioning Iran-Libya Act that could harm India. And eventually India gave up, pulled back from the project, citing security concerns, since the pipeline would cross Pakistan to enter India. But in reality, it was the incentives that the US provided to India, such as India's nuclear program, if New Delhi quit the pipeline project. Pakistan remained involved, but eventually also due to the US and Saudi opposition, Pakistan too began to withdraw from the effort. So the project basically went through many ups and downs and eventually faded away and may now be gone completely, to provide natural gas to Pakistan. Despite all these challenges, Iran's fundamental approach toward Pakistan did not dramatically change since the 1979 revolution. One of the most important reasons that both countries didn't play ethnic and religious cards against each other is the striking similarities in the region, Balochistan, Pakistan, and Sistan Balochistan of Iran. But I will, hopefully, if I get a chance, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Let me also mention Afghanistan, that today's dire situation in Afghanistan is really a sobering reminder of how complex the South Asia region is, and the importance of seeking profoundly thoughtful regional rather than local solutions. Iran is one of the most active forces within Afghanistan, has heavily invested there to enhance its soft power, Iran has maintained, has always had presence in Afghanistan. The only time that it was disrupted was during the Taliban regime, but even then, the government of President Khatami tried to re-engage with Afghanistan. So Iran has always considered a return of the Taliban to power, unless through a political process of conflict resolution, as a disaster. But in recent years, with the rise of numerous insurgent groups, such as ISIS Khorasan, Iran has signaled a willingness to accept an Afghan government that includes Taliban, also basically power sharing. And is mostly in recent weeks, especially in recent weeks, Iran is getting more involved and more active in the so-called Afghan peace process, take a mediatory role, basically. There are challenges, very significant and serious challenges. Iran and Afghanistan, there is a dispute over water. Helmand, Afghan call it Helmand, Iranian call it Hirmand. It is a transboundary water that flows into Iran from Afghanistan, and Iranian accuse Afghans of blocking the water. Afghans maintain that Iran is taking more than its defined shares. In reality, there is no way to have a accurate measurement of measuring water, since the system that was set up by the United States in 1970s was destroyed by the former Soviet Union later. The other issue, also major challenge, poppy cultivation in Afghanistan. Iran is a major transit route for the close to $30 billion annually of heroin and opium, traffic to Western Europe from Afghanistan. And drug addiction is becoming, or has already become, Iran's number one social issue, with over 3 million addicts, mostly young people. If I get a chance later, maybe we will talk about the Shia community, but 20 years have passed since the events of September 11, 2001, and subsequent invasion of Afghanistan by US and allied forces. Yet there is no clear prospect of a US or anybody emerging as the winner in this excruciating war. In contrast, the region is facing an even graver situation, further complicated by ethnic, economic, and transboundary conflicts, Iran's continued nuclear dispute with the US, and a new emergence of insurgency in the South Asia region. The expansion of the Wahhabi ideology and the rise of ISIS is a ticking bomb in the region. And, the vacuum that is created by the US forces and international forces leaving Afghanistan is being filled by the Taliban and and other militants, threatening a free fall into a new era of fundamentalism and a creation of a new safe havens for terrorists. Let me conclude by saying that a US policy of brute force has not prevailed. Maximum pressure has harmed the entire South Asia region and prevented the natural economic development that Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India could have enjoyed. So questions could be asked: how would the region look today if the US had not reimposed sanctions? Or what regional dynamics might have taken shape in the absence of US and Iran animosity and differences? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Aman. This was so enlightening. And again, I'm getting so many questions in my Q&A, and we'll get to those questions after, again, the opening remarks. I would like to give the screen to Dr. Tazmini and her understanding of Iran and Russia alliance in the Middle East and the relationship Of course, Iran has a long history with the big bear in the north, and let's see how this relation is unfolding these days.
Thank you so much, Behruz. Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak on this panel. And thank you to the Mossavar-Rahmani Center, my co-panelists, and the audience for tuning in. Now, when it comes to Russia, Iran has been looking eastbound for a while now, with the partnership steadily expanding and proving to be somewhat durable despite these asymmetries and inconsistencies in the partnership. To begin with, the partnership has always been fraught with distrust, with suspicion, with doubt, stemming from the historical antagonism that goes all the way back to the treaties of Golestan and Turkmenchai that resulted in the secession of Persian territories in the Southern Caucasus to the Russians in the 19th century. Now, this mistrust gained traction when Russia dragged its feet in fulfilling contracts it had signed with Iran. I'm referring to the construction of the Bushehr power plant and the delays in the delivery of the S-300 missiles. Now, Russia stalled for years, and this was especially pronounced during the time when President Medvedev and President Obama were toying with the idea of a reset in Russian-American relations. Russia flagged up international sanctions to justify postponing the delivery, when, strangely enough, US sanctions against Iran at the time did not encompass the transfer or the sale of conventional arms. However, as one Iranian official put it, whilst Russia delayed in its deliveries, it did deliver in the end, and there's something to be said about that. So that's one way of seeing it. But generally, these irregularities have led to a lot of doubt in the partnership, with accusations that Russia uses Iran as a provisional counterweight, or that Iran is a bargaining chip, or that Russian-Iranian relations, the degree of expansion and contraction in their cooperation levels is a reflection of whether US-Russian relations are amicable or hostile at the time. And then there's Russia's fraternization with Israel. Israel has intensified airstrikes against Iranian targets and assets in Syria, with Russia relatively silent on the matter. Iranians complained that Russia had not provided enough aerial protection. Another sore spot are the lucrative arms contracts that the Kremlin has with Iran's regional Arab rivals, as well as the energy diplomacy it was engaged in recently with Saudi Arabia and the OPEC Plus group. Again, all of this is pointed as evidence that Russia is a fickle friend, that it's opportunistic, and that it's an unreliable partner. But the Russian strategy is very clear. Russia seeks global prestige. It sees itself as a global power. It's not a great power. It's not a rising power like China. And it wants to play a role on the international stage. So it presents itself as an arbiter, as a co-manager of international affairs, as a power broker. It has security and economic imperatives, especially since 2014, following the annexation of the Crimea. It has been sanctioned, so it needs access to capital. And it also seeks geopolitical stability in order to prevent oil prices from fluctuating and also to secure market for its arms sales. Tehran is well aware that Russia has to play this kind of balancing act between warring or feuding parties. So it understands that there are these limits to the partnership. Now, despite this tension, cooperation has been expanding. And for years, Russia has acted as a bulwark against Iran's economic and political isolation through arms sales, technical military exchanges, regional cooperation, as we have in their alignment in Syria, as well as nuclear cooperation. Now, last year, Zarif confirmed that Tehran was planning to extend a 20-year agreement with Russia, which is set to expire next month, pertaining to a series of petrochemical and weapons deals. Now, cooperation on nuclear energy is a very important area because it is one of the areas of the market that Russia can dominate when it comes to Iran. In 2014, Russia agreed to build 2 more units, nuclear units, for the Bushehr plant by 2026. And despite sanctions, both Moscow and Tehran have reaffirmed that they are going to adhere to the terms of the contract and they will still continue along with it. When it comes to conventional arms, Russia is a supplier of sophisticated technology with no strings attached, meaning that it doesn't interfere in Iran's domestic affairs. It doesn't ask Iran to change its human rights record or its behavior domestically. So that works to Iran's advantage. And with the arms embargo recently lifted in October, President Rouhani has indicated that Iran would be buying a host of new weapons from Russia. Again, Russia has to play a balancing act because it cannot sell equipment that will antagonize or provoke both the regional rivals, Iran's regional rivals, and the United States and Europe. Now, when it comes to economic relations in general, bilateral trade is somewhat anemic. It's negligible, and that has to do with the fact that there's very little overlap between Russian and Iranian respective imports and exports. Investment has been somewhat hampered by US sanctions, as well as financial obstacles. Now, there are always these consultations on these mega projects, but many of them have failed to materialize. Russia is under sanctions itself. It has an unreformed economy. There's been a drop in oil prices. It's hard to get credit for either one of them. And so this is an area that is still a little bit flaky in that sense. But there is symbolic economic diplomacy. And Russia has, throughout the years, showed that it is willing to navigate Iran's economy. So, for example, Russia supports Iran's regional economic integration, inviting Iran to join the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union, which is based on free trade agreements that creates these conditions for preferential trade rates between Iran and union members. Another example is that Russia gave Iran access to an alternative payment channel, the Russian variant, the SPFS, when the Belgian SWIFT banking network cut off Iran banks from its messaging system. In other areas, they've just signed a new deal to cooperate on cybersecurity activities and information security. Now, politically, this is the domain where Russia has been the most proactive. Russia has shielded Iran against international acrimony. It has thrown Iran several lifelines in the Security Council. It's either watered down or it has vetoed sanctions, with Russian officials vociferously defending Iran in the international media. In terms of strategic, military, and regional cooperation, as I mentioned, they're aligned in Syria, which has broadened the scope of diplomatic and military exchanges, although the two clash when it comes to post-war governance, state building, military reform, and there is a competition in the economic arena. Russia's use in 2016 of the Shahid Noje airbase to bomb targets in Syria marked a striking new development in Russian-Iranian relations. It was the first time since the Iranian Revolution that Iran had permitted permitted foreign use of an Iranian base. There was also speculation of this budding military alliance in 2019 when Russia, along with China and Iran, carried out naval drills in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. And actually, I think as they've just kicked off in the second series of trilateral naval exercises in the northern part of the Indian Ocean. Again, the goal is to make a statement. It is to enhance security of maritime trade. But this does not mean that Russia is Iran's security guarantor. It is not a security provider for Iran. Russian and Iranian cooperation is not defined militarily. These measures are really only an affirmation of the partnership. On a broader level, Russia proposed a multinational Persian Gulf collective security concept in July 2019. This project has met with lukewarm reception. Russia seeks to act as an architect of this structure, and the concept echoes Iran's objective of building a Persian Gulf security architecture based under a UN umbrella and not one underwritten by the United States. Now, this brings me to my final point, which I think is the most important, significant pillar that buttresses Russian-Iranian alignment. Moscow and Tehran have a very similar logic they have a very similar political logic and understanding of the international arena. And it is this ideational synergy that explains the durability and the development of this partnership, despite ups and downs. Both states vehemently oppose the universalist normative aspirations of the international system, which they deem as a threat to their own civilizational identities. They are both anti-hegemonic. They oppose the idea that a single state or a constellation of states, an order, being able to impose particular normative values and power structures as universal. So they are in favor of sovereign internationalism as opposed to liberal interventionism. Both states place a premium on state sovereignty. They denounce Western interventionism, color revolutions, democracy promotion campaigns, and regime change and the like. Moscow in particular opposes the US-led Atlantic ideological power system. And as a countermeasure, it aims to create a sort of a counterbalance by creating these multi-orders within an overarching interorder. It seeks to create an interorder of sovereign states within an overarching multi-order international system. And so the Russian-Iranian partnership can be seen as one of these interorders within a larger multi-order international system. And in this light, both states are committed to more pluralistic institutions, alternative integrative networks on a regional level in order to create this counterweight to US unipolarity. So the Eurasian Economic Union or the Shanghai Cooperation Council, or even Iran's 25-year agreement with China should be seen within this conceptual or ideational framework. So generally, their alignment it's assembled within a broader range of shared priorities and principles. So hopefully this will provide a bigger frame for our discussion. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tazmini. This was amazing. So much information to unpack right there. And I'm already getting many questions about the points you raised. But let me go to Dr. Yazdanshenas for a conversation, a presentation about relations between China and Iran, and then and it's interesting that the three topics are so interrelated. I mean, it's pretty hard to talk about like India and Iran without bringing in China, and it's very difficult to talk about Russia without considering Iran's southern routes and the Chinese presence in Iranian economy. So let me just ask Dr. Yazdanshenas to take the screen, and then we'll have a little short conversation, and then I go to audience questions. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to present in this online virtual roundtable. I begin the discussion by briefly talking about the history of People's Republics of China and Iran relations, and then I will examine the new strategic partnership from the perspective of Iranians and from the perspective of Chinese, and at the end, I will discuss about its regional and extra-regional implications. Two ancient Asian civilizations, two partners in the sectors of trade, economy, politics, culture, and security, with a similar outlook and many mutual, bilateral, and multilateral interests, will consider one another strategic partners. This is the opening sentence of the document of a 25-year deal between China and Iran, which is revealed in July 2020. There has been a lot of discussions about the documents since it is leaked. The deal is designed to pave the way for considerable Chinese investment in Iran's strategically important sectors, and it also contains security cooperation and intelligence sharing. Historically, the Sino-Iranian relationship dates back to the early 1970s. Iran has the longest history of bilateral relations with China in the region. But their bilateral relations have always been defined in a triangle, which the United States is the third party, and at different times, the patterns of friendship and enmity between the three sides of this triangle have been different. China and Iran share a common history as independent regional powers. Both were impacted by European imperialism in previous centuries and by US foreign policy from the second half of the 20th century. Both are viewed with suspicion by the US, which has tried to counter or contain them. Concurrently, the US 2018 National Defense Strategy has clearly called China a revisionist competitor, seeking to reshape global order, starting with reordering the Indo-Pacific region to its advantage. Washington has always adopted a containment policy against EU. China and Iran thus have a common interest, at least to an extent, of standing up against US pressure. In Iran, it seems that a consensus has been reached on the necessity of expanding relations with China. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, has appointed Ali Larijani as Iran's special envoy to pursue the issue, with the aim of signaling to the Chinese that Tehran wants a strategic and long-term partnership and relationship with China, regardless of the incumbent administration's political leanings. Two main reasons have led to this consensus among Iranian policymakers. The first one is related to the emerging developments in the structure of the international system. China is currently the world's second largest economy and the only country. Iranian policymakers believe that Iran should expand its relations with China. It wants to strengthen its position in the international system. Some policymakers believe that it looked to the West both in the years before the revolution, looks to the West in the years before the revolution, after the revolution, and now looking east, moderate and can balance Iranian's approach. The second that refers to the policies adopted by Trump's administration against Iran, policies such as launching maximum pressure campaign and US withdrawal from the JCPOA, and the inaction of European and their lack of will to stand up to the United States despite their commitments. For Iran, close ties with China can be an economic lifeline. It can help Iran to save its sanction-hit, cash-strapped economy by assuring the sale of its oil and gas to China. In addition, Iran will be able to use its strategic ties with China as a bargaining chip in any possible future negotiations and relations with the Western countries. It demonstrates that tough measures, severe measures, such as Trump's maximum pressure campaign, no longer works when it comes to Iran. In the long term, Iran's strategic proximity to China implies that Tehran is adopting the so-called Look East policy in order to boost its regional and military power. The Chinese-Iranian initiative permits Iran to further expand its influence in the Middle East too. Iran has pragmatically utilized the ongoing developments in the region to enhance and boost its position and to involve non-Western major powers to engage in the Middle East security equations, like Russian-Iranian alliance in Syria. A new strategic approach to Iran is shaping in China too. For China, Iran is no longer just a market, but it's something much more than that. The changes in the Middle East security architecture in the 21st century, the United States' lack of willingness to further involve directly in the Middle East conflicts and problems, and reducing the strategic value of the Middle East for the US give China the incentive to step up to strengthen its position in the region. As China's 2019 Defense White Paper has emphasized on its overseas interest as an indispensable part of its national security. Iran's influence in the region is recognized by Chinese. They view Iran as a country with many allies in West Asia. Iran can withstand US pressure, and that is commendable for Chinese. The Chinese know that Iran is the only country in the Persian Gulf which is not the US ally. Other countries such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia will comply if the United States instructs them not to work with China, for example, on 5G technology. Iran is also the only country in the region that is not a promoter of takfiris in the Middle East. And besides, it enjoys a more geostrategic advantageous position comparing to other countries of the Persian Gulf. One of China's incentives to strategically forge ties with Iran can be to respond to the US efforts to balance Chinese power in East Asia, employing external balancing policy. According to this policy, states try to neutralize a rival's power by relying on the ability of allies and new allies. In this way, China looks to expand its influence in the Middle East and strengthen Iran as a bulwark against Western influence in the region. The Iran-China proximity can help China guarantee its energy security too. The Persian Gulf supplies more than half of China's energy needs, though, thus securing the freedom of navigation through the Persian Gulf is of great importance for China. Saudi Arabia, a close US ally, has now become the top supplier of crude oil to China, and this dependence to Saudi Arabia is at odds with China's general policy of diversifying its energy sources and not being reliant on one supplier. As we know, China's other Arab oil suppliers in the Persian Gulf all have close security ties with the United States. China fears that as the trade war and the tensions between Washington and Beijing intensify, the United States may put pressure on those countries not to supply Beijing with the energy it needs. So a strategic partnership with Iran is both a hedge and an insurance policy. It can provide China with an assured and discounted source of energy. Considering extensive recent US-China power competition, Beijing-Tehran close ties entails global, at least extra-regional implications. It provides China the opportunity to monitor the Strait of Hormuz, maybe in the future, to challenge US naval dominance in the Persian Gulf, and to shape a network of strategic hubs in the Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman. The Gulf of Aden consisted of Djibouti, Gwadar, Chabahar, and Jazz. Building such a network at least can balance US power projection in Indian Ocean and paves the way to rewrite its regional security order. And that is what Chinese strategic literature has called March West, and the 2019 US Indo-Pacific strategy has mentioned it as China's effort to rewrite the order in the Indo-Pacific region. Iran-China strategic proximity also affects the balance of power in South Asia, with particular consequences for India as an emerging pro-US regional power. This new strategic partnership would have political, security, and economic implications to the detriment of New Delhi. Should China replace India in strategic railway and portway development projects in Chabahar and Jazz, it hinders India's dream of connecting Bombay to Moscow via the North-South International Corridor. Besides, the new phase of bilateral relationship provides Beijing with a great opportunity to participate in constructing the strategic port of Jazz, which is situated to the east of the Strait of Hormuz. Not only can China's presence in the Jazz development project eliminate any potential chance for India to take part in this program, but China's wider presence on the main energy transmission route can also jeopardize India's energy security. Moreover, Sino-Iranian strategic partnership provides new opportunities for Pakistan, which is India's key rival in South Asia. Such regional interconnectedness leads to further security cooperation between Beijing, Tehran, and Islamabad, and to advance China-Pakistan economic corridor. The corridor is part of China's ambitious Belt and Road initiative, which is aimed at connecting Gwadar port with China. China's investment in Chabahar port and connecting it to Gwadar will provide China access to Central Asia and Europe through Iran. The idea of integrating Tehran into the Belt and Road Initiative through expanding Pakistan-China economic corridor to Eurasia via Iran makes the foundations of the triple axis of China, Iran, Russia, all of which have much in common against the US global hegemony. Where this new partnership will bring two countries and the region, we should wait and see.
Thank you so much. And these are fascinating interventions. And I wanted to thank you again for these really insightful comments. And one of the things that I did not hear you mention was the, I mean, because it is related to all three of you, is the Shanghai Cooperation Project and Iran's role in it, and how is that possible for Iran? Is there any possibility for Iran to think about the Shanghai Cooperation as an alternative to its trade relations with the West? And what's the status of that? Because I know that Iran was an observer in the meetings, and the question about membership of Iran in the Shanghai Cooperation was raised a number of controversies. But I was wondering if you can comment on that, and what's the status of Iran in relation to Shanghai Cooperation Group and the prospects of it. Should we start? I see Fatemeh is coughing, so I'm gonna skip her for now and go to perhaps Ghoncheh to see if would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Well, as far as I know, one of the hurdles is a legal hurdle. The admission or the membership needs to, well, Iran would have to be out of the whole sanctions regime. A sanctioned entity cannot be a member, if I'm not mistaken. So one of the incentives that Iran has in getting all of these Trump-era sanctions reversed is that it will permit it to gain access into these international organizations, because China also will raise that as an issue, and it has, because it doesn't want to fall foul of the United States. So there are certain legal aspects to it. And I know that Iran has been keen on joining, and Russia has every so often continues to support Iran's observer status, and it reaffirms that quite vocally often.
Zakiyeh, would you like to comment on that?
I think that joining Iran to the Shanghai Cooperation has lots of complexities, and I think that Iranian policymakers are well aware of that it's somehow it's not possible for the foreseeable future. But I think they are searching for some bilateral relations mainly, instead of joining Shanghai Cooperation as a panel against the Western pressure.
Very good. Just a note that we lost Fatemeh Aman for now, but she's coming back, so that if there are questions for her, I would pose those questions a little bit later. There was a question from the audience for Dr. Tazmini on, because you also wrote a book on comparing Iran and Russian revolutions, and the question is a very important one, I think, that that if you think that the same kind of regimes of sanctions that was imposed against the Soviet Union and the pressure for the Soviet Union to spend on its defense budget and the pressure that it put on the state under the Soviet Union to sustain the livelihood of its state employees and on its own kind of bureaucratic base that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you see that same parallel situation between Iran and the Soviet Union in that sense? Are these sanctions inevitably going to pressure Iran to increase its expenditure on defense and gradually lose more and more its ability to maintain a sort of popular base because it's losing its ability to finance it? You're muted.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. But there are vast, there are so many differences in that. I mean, that question is so broad. Because in Russia, first of all, in the Soviet Union, we had Gorbachev, who was the leader, and he launched this vast program of reform, glasnost, perestroika. There was, reconstruction of the economy, and then there was political openness. And there were all of these contradictions in the system and structural inefficiencies. And so a lot of that had to do with the system itself that couldn't hold itself. There were too many discrepancies in the system itself. Yes, the accelerated military spending is something that we can compare. Iran is obviously overstretched. But any country that is under sanctions or political isolation doesn't necessarily disintegrate. So the Soviet Union was a vast, multi-ethnic, multinational, vast country that fell apart because of the nationality issue as well, the ethnic tensions, and those sorts of things are absent in Iran. They're not comparable to the situation in the Soviet Union. If there are any sorts of ethnic tensions, they're usually smoothed out. And they don't have that political opening that there was during Gorbachev's leadership. Of course, the sanctions do put a strain on Iran's sort of strategic reach. Certainly Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon has been affected because of the coffers being low on resources. So it does have an effect, but I mean, they're completely different situations and not really comparable in that aspect.
Fatemeh, do you think that you can participate now? I mean, I don't know, you started coughing and I didn't want to, you're muted too, so.
I just did the COVID test, so good that it's not.
Okay. Nowadays, you don't want to get close to people who are coughing or having a flu-like symptoms.
Yes.
No,
I'm
that's
sorry.
fine.
I'm really sorry. It's
no, that's fine. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions from the audience that are addressed to you, and a very important question also that as you mentioned in your wonderful presentation. One of the sticking points for Iran now is the relations with Taliban in Afghanistan. And as we know, Iran and Taliban always were on two different sides of strategic thinking in the region and never had good relations. And it put Iran in a very awkward position that with the rise of these kind of jihadi takfiri groups that also are outside of Taliban domain, is Iran going to be flexible and change its relation and attitude towards the Taliban, especially since the US is entering or has already entered this peace negotiation with them? And does Iran envision a Taliban-led future for Afghanistan, and how can it even imagine that?
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's has long answer. I will try to make it as brief as possible. You remember when in my presentation, when I talked about Iran's continued presence in Afghanistan? Iran has always had a presence in Afghanistan. It was only briefly, cut during the Taliban regime when the Iran diplomats were killed in Mazar Sharif back then in the late 90s. That was the only time that Iran left Afghanistan, didn't have a presence in Afghanistan. But even under these circumstances, Iran tried, the government of President Khatami tried to just re-engage with Afghanistan. Iran helped formation of an interim Afghan government after the fall of Taliban. Iran helped United States actively and was incredible help in the Bonn conference. Remember the conference
Yes.
that was held for Afghanistan reconstruction. Iran managed to bring all these warlords who were really at odds with each other, brought Ismail Khan to the conference, brought you name it. Iran expelled Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the warlords who Iran hosted for some time, because Hekmatyar started, expressing anti-US sentiment regarding the Afghanistan fall of Taliban. So Iran expelled Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. The things changed with the access of evil State of the Union speech by President Bush. When Iran was branded along with North Korea and Iraq as axis of evil, that was the time that Iranian got worried. I believe the concern became really serious, that the suspicious that maybe Afghanistan is going to be used as a base to attack Iran. That must have been the origin of Iran getting in touch with the Taliban. They provided them with explosives and things like that to make it harder for the US, for the occupied forces in Afghanistan, but not to the point that the Afghanistan government would, Afghanistan would turn into, fall of chaos. With Iranian heavily invested in Afghanistan, but the concern became even intensified even more when in 1990, in 2015, with the presence, with what was known as presence of the Daesh Khorasan, Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan, mostly insurgent groups from different parts of Central Asia and even China, Chechens into Afghanistan. That is when Iran, thinking that the Afghan government is not strong enough to combat this threat of ISIS, that they turn to Taliban. Right now, they are actively involved. They just hosted a meeting with the delegation of Taliban leadership. They are now trying to, they have taken a mediatory role, basically, participating in the Afghan peace process and trying to mediate between Afghan government and the Taliban. And interestingly, they claim, and it has been confirmed, that they have they leave the Afghan government know about any meeting they have with the Taliban in advance.
Very good. Again, I mean, that continues to be one of the big puzzles of the region, and to make things a bit more complicated, as if it already is not. But there are a couple of questions about the Iran-China relation in relation to Iran-India relation, and Zakiyeh already talked about the Gwadar in Pakistan, and ultimately, what the Chinese are trying to do with the agreement with Iran is to use Iran as a conduit, as Zakiyeh so nicely elaborated on that, as a conduit to European market and under the One Belt, One Road project, and to Central Asia. But at the same time, this is also India's ambition to have that kind of connection to Central Asia and possibly to Europe. And so there's a competition obviously going on between India and China over access to the Iranian ports, particularly now in Chabahar. How does that manage? How is that managed at this moment? This competition, and it appeared to me again in reference to audience questions that India is more vulnerable to U.S. pressures than China, and the loser in this kind of give and take is more India than China. But if you want to sort of unpack that, maybe I start with Zakiyeh, because this is also related to the Iran 25-year agreement with the Iran and China and the One Belt, One Road project that many in Iran compare to Turkmenchai. Anything that is very kind of unfair and unjust in Iran is referred as Turkmenchai treaty, and the treaty that Iran signed with Russia in the early 19th century to give up parts of northern territories in Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia. So let's start from there. I mean, how is this playing out in this kind of three-sided relation, China, India, and Iran, and then of course the big kind of presence of U.S. sanctions on top of all that?
Sorry, should I talk or is...
let me start with Zakiyeh and then you go back to you, Fatemeh. Thank you.
Okay. It's a very interesting question. And I think that when we want to talk about the relationships, the Iran relation with India or the Iran's relation with China, we should talk about these countries with the third party, which is the United States. As we know, India is a pro-US rising power in the South Asia. So it's not like China. China is acting more independently, and it's as a rising power, which is the second, which has the second largest economy in the world. It has the capacity to play more independently, but India it's not in this position. But it's interesting that Chabahar was the only exception from US sanctions, and I guess it is because the United States wanted to use India in order to not push Iran more to the arms of China.
Fatemeh, yes.
Yeah, just I will try to remember the exact question. I think you mentioned that China and India are competing with each other over a presence in Central Asia. First of all, China has already huge, major presence in Central Asia. It's India, who's just $1 billion a year. That's really nothing compared to what China already has with in the markets of Central Asia. The other thing is that with Gwadar and Chabahar are not competitions. I believe, Gwadar is a major, giant, partly military project, and Chabahar is just a commercial. And the size, you can't compare it. I have to disagree with Zakiyeh on the she is more optimistic about China's intention. China is really, just if you see the history of what they have done to some Asian countries, what, you know, when they go there, they invest and they robbed, I'm sorry for using this word, those countries. And even so with Pakistan, Pakistan is one of the closest allies of China. China has helped Pakistan enormously in all major economic and has been involved and presence in political life in Pakistan. But still, just recently, when Pakistan couldn't secure the fund for the rest of that BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, they threatened Pakistan. There is really belief that China is taking these countries as hostage. And, I can't imagine a country like China who just out of respect and the love for a country like Iran would get so much engaged. And but it was smart of Iran to signal that if India doesn't finish the project in Chabahar or delays more, any longer, that they would involve China. Mr. Aghay Zarif said in Pakistan, invited Pakistani to get involved in Chabahar and express willingness for Iran to get engaged in Gwadar. So that's a smart way to do, to make partners move. But with China, I mean, Iran can never be as close to China as Pakistan is, or Sri Lanka was, for instance. China is not has an never-ending appetite for energy, for natural resources, and I would not necessarily see any, friendship or love for any country, not alone Iran.
Okay, that's. I want to get back to this comment in a bit, but I want to pose this question for Ghoncheh, and then through that question come back to the China relations with Iran. There's a question there that you mentioned, Ghoncheh, that Russia is facilitating different kinds of payment channel with Iran, and the question was that how different is that from what the EU established in Instext, and has it been something reliable that Iran can think of some version of a normalized trade with Russia in the midst of all these financial sanctions that are happening? Can it offer Iran a way out via Russia? And I want to raise a second question, which then will take us back to the question of China that a couple of our viewers raised, and that is how much Russia and China see Iran as a leverage. How much do these two players invest on expanding relations with Iran in relation to having a bargaining chip with the Americans and possibly with the EU? So let's start with the question of payment channels and Instex and how different that is, what the Russians are offering Iran. And then we go to this kind of instrumental relations between China and Russia with Iran. Ghoncheh?
Thank you. I'm no expert in financial instruments, but in general, I can tell you that the SPFS as an alternative payment system is more politically motivated. Technically speaking, you cannot compare it to SWIFT. I mean, SWIFT is in 200 countries. It's connected to about 11,000 major organizations. The messaging that SPFS has is half as many as SWIFT. So technically speaking, you cannot really compare it to SWIFT or Or now, if we're going to speak about Instex, Instex let Iran down. There was one successful transaction, as far as I know, in March of last year, and it was for medical supplies, and it was hailed as a great success. But then, as far as I know, it was just halted there, and that was also evidence that the Europeans had not pushed it hard enough to come up with ways to salvage Iran's continued compliance in the nuclear deal and to sort of continue stay floating above water and to save itself from so many problems that we've seen in the economy being strangulated by these sanctions. So I think it's important to understand that you cannot compare. It is not a solution. It is more of a political statement that Iran is not alone, that Russia can be creative by creating these sorts of mechanisms in a non-Western context. And so I think it's more a statement about that rather than being something viable, an instrument that Iran can really rely on. And of course, Iran trying to get back into the nuclear deal is because it wants to open up to the West, to the European markets, and wants to be part of a global financial system. In relation to the second question, I don't know if you want me to answer for the Iran portion or the question of leverage.
Yeah, I mean that's what's behind again a couple of questions about like what's Russia's interest in relations, or how do the Russians benefit from relationship with Iran? Of course, there are very tangible economic benefits in terms of arms deals and the like, and also the political. I mean, that's a question of the political benefits of this, and are the Russians thinking instrumentally about Iran that they can expand their relation and then they use their influence over Iran as a bargaining chip when they're negotiating with Americans over other matters?
Sure. Russia does play the Iran card, and it doesn't just play the Iran card, it plays many cards, and that is because it wants to be an indispensable actor in the international arena. Iran gives it more diplomatic clout, yes. If we move beyond a practical, strategic, economic interests, it gives Russia the sort of indispensability that it looks for. If we think about, for example, the Syrian arena, Russia has benefited greatly from Iran's engagement there. The whole premise of Russia's Syrian strategy was based on a partnership with Iran. Iran was the one that invested blood and treasure, it had boots on the ground. And what Russia did was provide aerial support. And of course, this was a mutually beneficial arrangement, but the reality was that Russia was also gaining, for example, basing rights in the Hamaim Bear base, or for example, Tartus naval base. So for practical purposes, Iran has facilitated Russia's presence on the international stage and also given it a foothold in the Middle East. Now, at the same time, Iran can be a bit of a problem for Russia. And so, and also it can, for example, in the Syrian situation, the US will have to speak to Russia about Iran's influence in Syria and whether Russia can help curb Iran's influence. Whether Russia can or not is a separate question, but in practical terms, it probably cannot. But the fact that they need to reach out to Russia gives them that kind of political presence and role that they're seeking.
So let me redirect that question towards you, Zakiyeh, and of course, many of the points that Fatemeh brought up about China's intentions and relations. Of course, we see many of those examples also in Africa, and China is leaving a very kind of tardy and suspect record in Africa at this moment. So is China also doing the same thing in Iran that they and one of the very first questions I received here was that is Iran going to be the hot potato of China? I mean, they're going to drop it when it suits them, and if not, they keep it as a possibility of again playing that card in international scene. And while you're at it, because there are a couple of questions, sorry that I'm piling up questions for you. Couple of questions about Iran's position on Uyghurs and if there is any conversation inside Iran and any kind of controversy and justification for Iran's silence on the treatment of Uyghurs in China.
Okay.
Too many questions.
Yes. I should say that I'm not in the position to be optimistic or pessimistic about China. I just said that what I said is what the Iranian policymakers perceive about the China and the future of Iran-China proximity and its implication. And about the second question, which if China would use Iran as a leverage in the future negotiations, I think, yeah, why not? Who doesn't? If China can use the Iran card as a bargaining chip, it will. But I think it's not necessarily a negative point, as Iranian will use the China card in their forthcoming negotiations with China in order to show the Western countries that they have other options. I think that China will use Iran in order to somehow weaken the U.S. position in the Middle East, or particularly in the Persian Gulf. And I think that Iranian policymakers are okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay. And about the third question, I think that there is a consensus among the Iranian policymakers about the necessity of having a new kind of relationship with the Chinese. Of course, there are some comments in the media, but the policymakers do not accept them, and most of the elites do accept that this is a very important relationship which we should invest on it.
Very good. Thank you. Fatemeh, I want to come back to you with a question that was raised earlier about Iran and India intelligence sharing. Iran-India relation is at so many different levels is very peculiar, because then we have Pakistan, a Muslim state, in between, and historically Iran has forged better relations, if I'm not mistaken, with India than Pakistan. And is there a conversation there about where does Iran stand in relation to the two countries, Pakistan and India, and whether Iran is part of any kind of intelligence sharing with India against Pakistan?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Iran and India relations wasn't there. It was before the revolution. Remember, India was in the so-called socialism camp.
That's right.
And Pakistan was an ally, one of the closest allies of Iran and the United States. So it was only after Pakistan proved to be more a loser in wars than a winner that Iran started, signaling getting closer to India, with Indira Gandhi coming to Iran and Shah traveling to India. Iran has managed to walk a very fine line when it comes to the conflict between between Pakistan and India, say over Kashmir. It's interesting, Iran supported India didn't, I mean, the trade or political relationship between Iran and India didn't change because of the events in Kashmir and what the Muslims population went through. And with Pakistan the same way. There is no, not that I'm aware, I mean, intelligence sharing against Pakistan, definitely not, because you see, Pakistan's security concern is mostly is India, is its borders with India. Iran's is with Pakistan, with so many different parts of the country. You know, India, so it is not an advantage for Iran to actively get engaged into this conflict, old conflict between India and Pakistan, and mainly stayed away from, any meddling, if you want. But I'm sorry, what part of your question that I think I forgot? But anyway, Iran and Pakistan, as I mentioned in my presentation, they stayed away from, playing ethnic or religious cards against each other, because they knew very well that it would backlash. Iran actively supported the regime of Shah, actively supported Pakistan in cracking down on Baluchi separatists back then. So there is a bound that they were both in CENTO agreement. There is a bound that, between Pakistan and Iran that will not be, I don't think it would be sacrificed for India or India for Pakistan. Iran has managed to stay neutral on this very controversial issue.
Yeah, very good. But I like the point of Kashmir that you brought up. That's where it kind of manifests itself. That where Iran stands in that relation is right on the question of Kashmir, and that's quite helpful.
Similar to Uyghurs in China, right? I mean, they're also Muslims. Iran.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Since we are getting close to the end of our conversation, I want to sort of go back to the subject, the topic of our panel, the Eastbound Iran with a question mark. I asked you this question earlier about the Russian, Chinese, Indian incentives and how do they see a expanding relation with Iran. How about Iran? Does Iran think that it can basically turn around and strategically move away from foundational economic, political relations and alliances with the European and American countries and go forge a more permanent, not instrumental, not kind of because of the pressures of the moment, rather a sustained relation with Russia, China, and India as an alternative to relations to Europe? Or Iran is also playing that card that, okay, if you put pressure on me, I have the option of going eastward. So we might not have the answer to that question, but I think that's an important element of the conversation that Iran, of course, is a very sort of strong actor in this situation, and they have their own vision of how they're playing their cards here. So is Iran's eastbound look is a tactical posture against the Western pressures, or there is a more kind of a strategic thinking of shifting alliances? So let me start with in the same order with Fatemeh and Ghoncheh and Zakiyeh, and then we end our meeting.
As I mentioned, Iran is in its current position partly out of desperation. Iran needs the West. Iran needs to be part of the, part of the West. Iran should not make itself block any ways, always to come back to where it was before. Of course, I mean, if you have the choice between both the West and East, you could be a winner. Then you would have the leverage, as you mentioned, to play to your advantage. But just staying where Iran is at this point, as it has turned in many other places, places to where engage with China, that is not the outcome that that's not a dream, basically. So I hope things are reversible.
Okay, very good. Ghoncheh.
Okay, I think that Iran is far more shrewd than we think. Iran looks to the east and it looks to the west simultaneously. And I've always said that Iran has agency in this partnership with Russia, that it is not a pawn on Russia's chessboard, that it is actually quite forward-thinking. To give you an example, when the JCPOA was signed, Iran immediately privileged the European commercial ties over Russian. Russian exports to Iran between 2015 and 2018 were about 2.5 billion, or rather there were $5 billion in exports to Iran, which is about 2.5% of the $210 billion in exports that were made to Iran. That's just a tiny fraction. Iran privileges European businesses. And let's talk about, for example, the aircraft industry. Iran will sooner pick a Boeing, an Airbus aircraft over the Russian Sukhoi superjets. So Russia's aware of that. And it has said before that, Iran is actually opportunistic. And when relations normalize with the West, it turns its back on us economically. And then the other thing is, Iran can rely on Russia being there for it. Why? Because that partnership is very much conditioned by Russian-US relations. Russian-US relations remain strained, and they have since 1991. Since the end of the Cold War, we've entered this era of cold peace. And it's highly unlikely that the United States will completely revamp its foreign policy towards Russia. Because first, it would have to shelve NATO expansion. It would have to turn a blind eye to Russia's aspirations in the former Soviet space. It's already, we hear sound bites about the Navalny opposition figure and the protesters, and there's a lot of criticism leveled towards Russia at the moment. Biden has said that we are no longer going to roll over to the Russians. So Iran can count on the fact that relations between the US and Russia will not normalize, and that it can always fall back on Russia. So it actually does look east and west, I would say.
Thank you so much. And you have the last word, Zakiyeh. You're on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I think that now, maybe not 4 years ago, but now Iranian policymakers have reached a consensus on the necessity of the Look East policy, regardless of the West approach toward Iran. And besides, I think that the antagonism and the animosity between the US and Iran is so serious, it cannot be resolved by, for example, something like US return to the JCPOA. Iranian policymakers always declare that Iran is ready to negotiate with the US to solve all the problems with the West, if they change their attitude toward Iran. But the reality is that I think they would not change their attitude toward Iran. They expect Iran to change its foreign policy behavior first, and Iranian elites perceive that Western countries would not tolerate Iran as an independent, powerful state in the region, regardless of its incumbent political regime. So I think that Iranians have chosen Look East policy as the last choice.
Very good. Thank you so much. This was so helpful, and I really appreciate your insightful comments and your remarkable answers to these complicated questions. And with apologies to all of the attendees and who raised questions, and I didn't get a chance to raise their questions for you. There are a number of questions about Turkey, about the Gulf states and the Caspian Sea, and there are so many questions there, and it seems like we are going to be contacting you again for another webinar to address those questions. And again, I thank all of you and all of the attendees for this wonderful panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.